All right, so now we're going to do an exercise using Braintree JavaScript SDK version 3 and Checkout JS version 4. So originally, Braintree has always maintained a separate integration with PayPal. This included all the main features that you have become accustomed to, including the overlay, the pop-up, and rendering Hermes. So let's open up the MISC Braintree original HTML file to see exactly how the original integration with Braintree works. All right, so under client MISC Braintree original. So this is the version 3 of an original Braintree integration. You'll see that I'm including the PayPal module. Here's my authorization token, and here are my just an object of options that I'm going to use for Braintree. So the first thing that you always do with a Braintree v3 JavaScript integration is create a client. So you call Braintree client create and give it the authorization token. So that gives you a client instance, and then you are going to use that client instance in the Braintree PayPal create call in order to create a PayPal instance, which is returned. So then after I get a PayPal instance, I'm going to set an event on click on my PayPal button. And then once the PayPal button's clicked, you just call PayPal instance.tokenized. You give it those options that I showed you above. And then you are going to get the response. So the result is actually the nonce, as well as the PayPal account info like you typically would see in the on payment method received callback. I'm just tossing that in a text box on the page, and that is it. And then the other thing to note is that my PayPal button is just a regular button because Braintree v3 doesn't have a way to render a PayPal button. All right, so let's take a look how that works in the browser. I'm just going to go to the Braintree original on the page. All right, so when I click my Launch PayPal button, you notice the pop-up comes up. So one thing you'll notice right away is that by default, there's no overlay in the background when you click the button. All right, so now when I log in, and I click continue, you'll see that I will get the PayPal details here. So now if I go back and I relaunch, you'll notice that I also get the pop-up again. So that's the other difference between the original Braintree flow and PayPal, is that if you're already logged in with PayPal, you should get the actual lightbox experience and not the pop-up. So those are the three main differences between the Braintree original and kind of what you would expect out of like a Checkout JS integration. The button rendering, the ability to have a lightbox mode, and then the overlay in the background by default. All right, so that was the original Braintree integration. But in February 2017, Braintree released their PayPal checkout module that is compatible with Checkout JS. It allows us to get all the functionality from Checkout JS, like the button rendering, the lightbox and pop-up, one-touch, and branded overlay on a Braintree integration without Braintree needing to duplicate the functionality in their code. So you need to include a new module like you would any other Braintree module. This time it's PayPal-checkout.min, and you also include the Checkout JS script. All right, so the new Braintree module has the following functions: a create payment. So this function creates and returns a pay ID via REST, and it accepts the Braintree options as an argument. So because it returns that pay ID, you would use it in the payment callback because that's where we get a token to render the PayPal experience. And the second function is the tokenized payment function. This function accepts the data returned from checkout.js, so that actual data object in the onAuthorize, it accepts the whole thing, and then uses it to reach out to Braintree, create that nonce, and then the nonce and the PayPal information is returned back in the callback or in the promise resolve. And that should be used in the onAuthorize callback. So now we can use these functions in the appropriate callbacks to leverage checkout.js with Braintree. So for this exercise, Braintree has come to us to assist a merchant to add PayPal as a checkout method in their integration. The merchant is already integrated with Braintree v3 client SDK. They have their client-side authorization token added on their page, and they just want to add PayPal as a checkout method. So let's open up the client, check out Braintree HTML, and finish the Braintree integration, the Braintree PayPal integration. So we'll locate part 1 on Braintree HTML and pause this video and take a couple minutes to try and solve this part on your own. Follow the inline comments to complete. All right, if you haven't done so, please pause now because I'm about ready to go over the answer to part 1. All right, so I'm going to navigate to checkout, Braintree, find part 1. So part 1, we can already tell, is in the payment callback. According to our table before, we want to call that create payment function. So it says use the PayPal checkout instance, which is available here. I'm just going to copy that. So PayPal checkout instance dot create payment, and the argument is Braintree PayPal options, and those Braintree PayPal options are up here, which are the options available to the Braintree SDK. And then return the result. So we will return the result of that function call. All right, so that should be it for the first part. I'm gonna go ahead and save it. So we should be able to click our button now, and it should render PayPal. So I'm gonna go back to our checkout Braintree integration. And when I click this, we should actually render PayPal because we are resolving that payment token. So it looks good. And we can also notice right off the bat that we have our nice little overlay, and we have our pop-up window, or our lightbox window, and we also have a rendered button. I'm going to cancel this, and then I am going to switch to the iframe scope in the console to execute the payment callback. So we did this in a previous exercise. I'm going to give you a second to do that on your own and see what exactly that payment function is resolving. So take a couple seconds to try that out on your own. All right, if you haven't paused to try that on your own, please do so now because I'm about ready to go through it. So I'm going to switch to the Sources tab, and I'm going to switch to the, I'm going to switch to the Console tab and switch to the iframe, and then I'm going to execute the window.xprops.payment function. I'm going to say .then. Looks like I already have it in here. I'm going to wait for it to resolve, and we can see that it resolved a pay ID. Awesome. And then we can also see if I were to change that to a vault flow. Refresh the page. So when I switched it to the vault flow and refreshed the page, you'll see that I actually resolved back a billing agreement ID. So that's pretty cool because we know that we can actually render checkout.js in the Hermes process by using a payment token or a billing ID in the payment callback. So now we can see how we can do that with a billing agreement ID. All right, so I'm going to just change that back to checkout. Save it. All right. Refresh my page. Now we'll move on to part 2. So if you didn't get the answer to this part, go ahead and take a moment and copy it in now, because we're moving on to part 2. So locate part 2 section in the Braintree HTML and pause this video and take a couple minutes to try and solve this part on your own. Follow the inline comments to complete. All right, if you haven't done so, please pause the video now and solve part 2 because I'm about to go through the answer. All right. All right, so find part 2. We'll see it's here in the onAuthorize function. It says use the PayPal checkout instance. So once again, I know I need to copy that, paste it in here. To execute the correct function callback, and I know the function based off that table is tokenized payment. The argument is the data returned from PayPal. So we actually use this data that Hermes actually compiles for us, and we pass it into this tokenized function. And it says return the result of it, and then execute setup finish. I'm going to execute .setup finish with the result, then execute setup finish with the response that was returned. So it would just be like this. All right, so I'm going to save this, and then we're going to go up real quick to see what exactly setup finish does so we can check that out. Just like before, setup finish just takes the data, pre-populates the form, and then calls this set click, and set click sets the on click on the submit button. So we're pre-populating the form, setting the on click to call transaction.sale, which is transaction.sales part 3. So we will go do that now. All right, so that's part 2. If you didn't get it, take a moment to type that in. If not, we are going to move on to part 3. So the final part, part 3, located in our braintree.html. Go ahead and pause this video and take a couple minutes to try and solve the part on your own and follow the inline comments to complete. All right, if you haven't done so already, please pause the video now because I'm about to go through the answer. All right, so we'll locate part 3, which is in our transaction.sale. And we saw before that this is what is executed when we click the submit button. And it says all we have to do is use the PayPal library to execute the AJAX call. So once again, like in our exercises before, we want to do a PayPal dot request dot post, because it says that we need to post it. More than likely we were going to return this. All right, so then it says post to this endpoint. All right, and then we are going to send the params variable, params, which is just taking the nonce out of the data that was returned. And then it says, then call the handle response function. So after that's done, we're going to do then handle response, which is just going to output our response into the DOM. All right, so I should be able to save it. Add a dot here. Save it again. All right, so now when I refresh my page, I should be able to go through the whole flow and have, obviously I already have button rendering. We'll see that this is where button.js is actually rendering the button for us into an iframe like we've seen before. So now when I click the button, we'll see that I'm getting, number one, I'm getting the overlay. And number two, I am getting the lightbox experience. So we filled all the gaps that we've talked about earlier. So this is what came back in the onAuthorize. You'll see that the nonce came back, the details, all the stuff that we used to see in the onPayment method received. You'll see that I pre-populated my form successfully, and now when I click place order, an AJAX call is being made to complete my transaction, and you'll see that my transaction was successful. All right. So that's the answer for part 3 of this exercise, and that's the final part. So if you didn't get that, please take a moment to finish this exercise, because we'll be moving on to converting version 3 to version 4 in Checkout.js in the next exercise.